Imagine a single, um, like a massive construction initiative that could simultaneously power an entire digital revolution for one nation,
Yeah.
permanently rescue another from just devastating annual floods, and trigger an absolute existential panic in a third.
Right.
That is exactly what is happening right now in the Blue Nile. I mean, when you look at a river, you usually just see flowing water.
Sure.
But if you look at the stack of research and diplomatic transcripts we are diving into today, that water transforms. It becomes, the ultimate battery to launch a tech boom, a geopolitical weapon, and really the absolute fragile thread keeping an entire civilization alive.
Yeah, it perfectly illustrates the ultimate dual nature of a natural resource.
Yeah.
Water is life,
Yeah.
unequivocally. But when you start engineering its flow on a massive scale, it instantly becomes about power, economics, and perhaps most importantly, sovereign destiny.
Which is exactly why we are so glad you are joining us for today's deep dive. Because our mission today is to unpack Ethiopia's newly announced mega projects on the Blue Nile. Specifically, we're looking at the Karadobi, Mandaya, and Beko Abo dams. We are going to look at the fierce downstream reactions they are causing and really figure out how the manipulation of a single river's momentum is actively rewriting the geopolitical map of the Horn of Africa. Because this is not just a story about pouring concrete. We are looking at the future of energy, deep historical grievances, and an incredibly delicate regional balancing act.
The stakes here could not be higher.
Sure.
I mean, when you examine the geopolitical landscape of the Blue Nile today, you're essentially looking at a preview of a fundamental tension the entire world will eventually have to navigate.
Oh, absolutely.
How do you reconcile one nation's absolute right to develop its infrastructure with another nation's non-negotiable historical reliance on that exact same natural resource?
Right. And to really get our heads around that tension, we have to start at the source, both literally and figuratively. We need to look at what Ethiopia is actually building. Because for the past decade or so, if you paid attention to this region, all the headlines were about the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Right, the GR.
But according to the architectural master plans in our sources, the GERD was merely phase one. It was just the icebreaker. Now that it is generating power, Ethiopia is moving to construct these 3 new massive dams.
Building the GRD shattered a long-standing psychological and diplomatic barrier, really. It proved what was possible.
Yeah.
But these new projects, the Karadobi, Mandaya, and Beko Abo, they represent a profound escalation in scale and ambition.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we need to visualize what is actually happening here. If the GRD was just the beginning, building 3 more mega dams in sequence feels less like a standard infrastructure upgrade and more like, an attempt to completely rewrite the economic DNA of the region.
Exactly.
They are constructing what civil engineers refer to as a cascade system.
Which is a brilliant piece of hydroengineering, honestly. Rather than relying on a single massive reservoir, a cascade system utilizes the natural topography of the river gorge to build a sequence of dams, one after the other.
I always used to think of it like a series of linked batteries. But looking at the engineering notes, it is much more dynamic than that, like a staircase almost.
Yeah, a staircase is a great way to put it. It is really about capturing hydroelectric head, which means maintaining the water's elevation and momentum.
Right.
Instead of the water just rushing down the mountains and dissipating its energy, it hits the first dam, builds immense pressure, spins the turbines, and then flows directly into the reservoir of the next dam to do it all over again.
Wow.
You are wringing every possible drop of kinetic energy out of the exact same volume of water.
So it's about maximizing efficiency through geometry.
Exactly.
And the projected output from this specific cascade is just staggering. Combined, the Karadobi, Mandaya, and Beko Abo dams are expected to generate roughly 5,700 megawatts of clean energy. That is a mind-boggling amount of electricity. But why the rush for a multi-dam cascade right now? I mean, what is the domestic urgency driving a 5,700 megawatt expansion?
If we connect this to the bigger picture and look at Ethiopia's domestic policy goals, this is a structural transformation.
Okay.
Ethiopia is attempting to leapfrog traditional industrial development and build a modern tech-driven infrastructure. They're actively fostering a digital economy.
Right.
And a digital economy is entirely reliant on baseload power. That's electricity that is constant, reliable, and totally immune to the fluctuations of solar or wind.
Yeah, our notes specifically mention the push to support tech startups in Addis Ababa, ensuring that hospitals have flawless, uninterrupted power grids and building out massive digital telecommunications networks.
Mhm.
You simply cannot have a thriving 21st century tech sector if your server farms go dark during a dry spell. You need that massive baseline stability.
Precisely. And the vision extends far beyond their own borders, too.
Right.
Ethiopia's ultimate goal with this cascade system is to generate a massive surplus of electricity that they can then export to neighboring countries.
Which fundamentally changes their geopolitical leverage, doesn't it? I mean, they aren't just selling a commodity, they are integrating regional economies into their own power switch.
Exactly the point. If you supply the critical electricity to Kenya, Djibouti, or Sudan,
Right.
those nations become physically tethered to your sovereign infrastructure. Ethiopia is positioning itself to become the undisputed energy hub of the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
It shifts their identity from a historically underdeveloped nation to an indispensable regional powerhouse. They want to provide the literal current that drives the economies surrounding them.
Okay, so Ethiopia gets this massive, perfectly regulated energy battery. But the physical reality of a river is a zero-sum game in the short term, right?
Yes, it is.
Every drop of water Ethiopia holds back to fill a reservoir and build that necessary hydrostatic pressure is a drop that momentarily stops flowing north across the border. And for the countries relying on that uninterrupted flow, that is not just an inconvenience.
It is the catalyst for a national security crisis.
Which brings us to the downstream realities, specifically Egypt.
Right.
Reading through these transcripts, Egypt's reaction to the Karadobi, Mandaya, and Beko Abo announcements isn't just typical diplomatic friction. It is absolute fury.
Yeah, fury is the right word.
And honestly, as a listener, it is easy to dismiss political outrage as posturing. But then you look at the geographical data. Egypt relies on the Nile for over 90% of its freshwater.
Over 90%. I mean, let that figure really sink in for a second.
It's crazy.
We are talking about a civilization of over 100 million people living in an arid desert environment, entirely sustained by a single geographic feature.
It is almost impossible to comprehend that level of vulnerability. I mean, think about your own city or state.
Right.
Imagine if a neighboring government suddenly announced they were building a facility that could actively throttle 90% of the water you use to drink, to irrigate your crops, to run your factories.
From a strategic perspective, it is terrifying.
Yeah.
When your entire demographic survival depends on one water source, any external entity gaining physical control over that tap is viewed as a literal existential threat.
Absolutely.
It is not an economic hurdle for Egypt. It is a question of survival. This is why Egypt has drawn an incredibly hard red line, publicly stating they cannot allow this cascade system to alter the historical flow of the river.
And to enforce that red line, Egypt isn't just pointing to their population density, they're pointing to international law.
Yes.
Looking at these source transcripts, it is really important we strip away any bias here and just look at the mechanics of Egypt's argument objectively. To defend their water security, they lean heavily on a very specific piece of paper, a 1959 treaty.
Right, the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement between Egypt and Sudan.
Mm.
In the realm of international water diplomacy, this document is the absolute bedrock of Egypt's legal defense.
And the mechanics of this treaty are wild when you look at the math. It literally quantified the river. It divided the annual flow of the Nile, granting Egypt 55.5 billion cubic meters of water, and Sudan 18.5 billion cubic meters.
Exactly.
So Egypt points to this historical quota and says, look, under international law, historical usage rights are paramount. We have built our entire nation around this exact volume of water for decades. You cannot unilaterally alter a flow that we have a legal right to consume.
And it is a strong legal argument if you subscribe to the doctrine of prior appropriation.
Okay, what's that?
It's essentially first in time, first in right. Because Egypt developed its infrastructure and formalized its water usage first, they argue those rights are locked in and protected against new upstream disruptions.
Okay, but I have to push back on that logic because of the math we just mentioned, 55.5 for Egypt, 18.5 for Sudan, that leaves a massive glaring hole in the equation. Where does Ethiopia fit into that treaty?
They don't.
Wait, really?
Not at all.
That is the detail in our sources that absolutely blew my mind. Roughly 85% of the water flowing into the Blue Nile originates inside the borders of Ethiopia. The rain falls on the Ethiopian highlands.
Right.
Yet when Egypt and Sudan sat down in 1959 to quantify and divide up the river's entire output, Ethiopia was completely excluded from the negotiations.
They were not invited to the table.
That's just wild.
The sovereign nation, where the vast majority of the natural resource originates, was completely omitted from the legal agreement that dictated the river's future.
I mean, it creates a completely impossible bind for international law.
Yeah.
Think about it like a massive industrial supply chain.
Okay.
Imagine two downstream distributors draft a legally binding ironclad contract between themselves to consume 100% of the output of a factory.
Hmm.
But they never actually consulted the person who owns the factory floor, the machinery, and provides 85% of the raw materials. Decades later, the factory owner decides they want to use some of their own materials to power a new machine on their own property. And the distributors wave this old contract in the air, claiming it's illegal.
The factory owner's response, naturally, is going to be, I never signed your contract.
Exactly.
Why would I be bound by an agreement that divided up my resources while intentionally ignoring my existence?
Which is exactly Ethiopia's sovereign rebuttal today. They are flat out rejecting the 1959 framework.
And what's fascinating here is we see the collision of two completely different paradigms of international law.
Yeah.
On one side, you have Egypt's reliance on historical usage rights, the sheer, undeniable reality that millions of people will suffer if that water quota drops. On the other side, you have Ethiopia asserting the doctrine of sovereign development rights.
They are essentially arguing that geography grants them sovereignty. Like, we have an absolute right to utilize domestic natural resources, to pull our population out of poverty, to build our digital economy, and to light up our hospitals regardless of colonial-era treaties we never agreed to.
Precisely. We are looking at a geopolitical stalemate in its purest form.
Yeah.
Neither nation is operating from a place of malice. They are both operating from vastly different, entirely rational paradigms of national survival.
Right.
A downstream nation facing existential dread over the potential loss of its lifeblood, clashing directly with an upstream nation asserting its right to modernize after being historically sidelined.
So we have this intense, immovable object versus unstoppable force dynamic between Ethiopia and Egypt. But as you dig deeper into the transcripts, you realize there is a third major player here.
Yes.
A wild card that completely scrambles the geopolitical calculus. And that is Sudan.
Sudan occupies an incredibly complex position, both geographically and politically. They are situated squarely between the Ethiopian highlands and the Egyptian border.
Now, if you are just looking at a map and considering the history, your initial assumption would be that Sudan is going to align in lockstep with Egypt.
Sure, yeah.
They are both downstream nations. They both rely heavily on the Nile. They were the two signatories who signed that 1959 treaty. You would think a unified downstream front would be inevitable.
It is the most logical assumption. But the reality on the ground, as detailed by former Sudanese water officials in the documents we are reviewing, is drastically different.
And here's where it gets really interesting, folks, because this was a massive aha moment for me. Our sources highlight that many Sudanese engineers and officials are looking at the Karadobi, Mandaya, and Beko Abo cascade system and realizing it might actually be a massive benefit to Sudan.
Right.
I had a really hard time wrapping my head around that at first. I mean, how can a massive set of dams that genuinely threatens Egypt's water security actually be an incredible boon for Sudan?
It fundamentally comes down to the physical mechanics of the river, specifically topography and sediment load. The Blue Nile is famous for its dark, churning waters. As it rushes down from the steep Ethiopian highlands during the rainy season, the sheer velocity of the water erodes the landscape. It picks up millions of tons of heavy sediment and silt.
And when that hyper-fast, sediment-choked water hits the flatter plains of Sudan, it just spreads out.
Violently. Historically, the unregulated velocity of the Blue Nile has caused devastating annual floods across Sudan.
Wow.
It washes away topsoil, it wipes out seasonal crops, and it routinely destroys infrastructure. It is a massive, incredibly dangerous seasonal hazard that Sudanese farmers just have to endure year after year.
Right.
But if you build a cascade system of highly engineered dams upstream...
The dams act as massive physical breaks. And filters, too.
Yes, exactly. The cascade system fundamentally alters the river's behavior. First, those vast reservoirs trap a huge portion of that destructive sediment before it ever crosses the border.
Okay.
But more importantly, the dams give Ethiopia the ability to regulate the velocity of the water year-round.
This is the part that changes everything for Sudan's domestic economy. Because instead of a massive destructive surge of water during the rainy season, followed by a trickle during the dry season, the cascade system takes that water, stores it, and releases it steadily to continuously spin its turbines. It turns a volatile, dangerous flood into a predictable, highly managed stream.
And the agricultural benefits of a regulated flow are transformative.
Hmm.
If you are a Sudanese farmer, preventing the floods from destroying your livelihood is the first massive victory.
Sure.
But the second victory happens during the dry summer months.
Because right now, during the dry season, the river level drops significantly, right? The water table basically plummets.
Exactly, which means Sudanese farmers had to spend an absolute fortune on diesel fuel to run heavy pumps, dragging water up from the depleted riverbed just to keep their crops alive.
Man, that's brutal. But if Ethiopia's dams are slowly, consistently releasing water throughout the entire dry season to generate their baseload power, the river in Sudan stays artificially high.
The water remains closer to the surface.
Yeah.
The pumping costs plummet.
Yeah.
Irrigation becomes cheaper, more reliable, and immensely more profitable.
So you have this incredible situation where pure engineering pragmatism, stopping floods, catching silt, lowering fuel costs for farmers, might actually trump decades of deeply entrenched political alliances.
Yeah.
Sudan is looking at the pure, tangible utility of the cascade. They are realizing that integrated mathematical river management serves their immediate domestic economy far better than clinging to a historical treaty just to maintain diplomatic solidarity with Egypt.
It throws the entire regional dynamic into flux. We are seeing how the mechanics of river regulation prove that one country's perceived existential threat can simultaneously be another country's agricultural salvation.
It's a stunning complication.
It really is.
So as you are listening to this, trying to piece together how a river shapes the world, let's just synthesize the balancing act we are watching unfold. You have Ethiopia rapidly pushing to construct an intricate, highly efficient cascade system to capture the momentum of their own geography, aiming to power a modern digital economy and become a regional energy titan.
Pushing back against that, you have Egypt grappling with a deeply understandable existential anxiety. Knowing that their entire civilization relies on a flow of water that is now being physically throttled upstream, driving them to fiercely defend historical treaties to ensure their survival.
Right, and caught in the crossfire is Sudan, abandoning ideological alliances for the pragmatic, day-to-day realities of flood control and agricultural survival. So why did you care about a set of dams thousands of miles away? Because this isn't just an isolated regional dispute. This is the blueprint.
It is a real-time stress test for the global future.
Exactly. As populations surge and developing nations rightfully push to modernize their economies, the tension between sovereign development rights and downstream existential reliance is going to ignite all over the globe.
Absolutely.
The Blue Nile is just the most dramatic proving ground we have right now.
Which raises a crucial question, and is a thought I want to leave you to mull over today. We have seen how the physical engineering reality of a cascade system fundamentally benefits a middle country like Sudan, purely through the mechanics of steady water flow and flood control. So looking ahead, could the sheer, undeniable economic benefits of integrated scientific river management eventually override decades of deeply entrenched colonial-era political treaties on a global scale?
That's a huge question.
Will engineering pragmatism ultimately rewrite the foundational rules of international diplomacy?
That is an incredibly fascinating question to ponder, because whether you see a river as a battery to power a digital revolution, a hazard to be managed, or the single fragile thread keeping your nation alive eventually, we all have to figure out how to share the exact same water.
Very true.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the mechanics behind the headlines, and we will catch you next time.